Hello, at long last, I've actually got some time to produce a short screencast for you all on how to go about writing up your Futures of Welfare assignment. There are two assignments from last year that I'm going to draw upon. I think they're just very good exemplars of outstanding work. Both of them receive first class honours grades. Anyway, the first one here, as you can see, the title is Autism Spectrum Disorder in the Workplace. The authors were Aoife Gallagher, Tara Henry and Aoife Mulligan, three outstandingly hard-working students from the ECCE program. Now, the topic of the program, of the assignment rather, was quite interesting in its own right. Autism, and individuals with autism, whether or not they could gain access to the workplace. You can see that the word limit and the word count rather for the three students in question was 7,771, and that was a pretty reasonable distribution over three people, well over 2,000 words each. So the first thing when you're coming about writing up your own assignment is we need an abstract. Now you can see in this particular abstract it's centered and it's italicized. Now I'd prefer that to be single line spacing and in italics, so that's fine. They include a list of abbreviations, if you're more than happy to use that yourselves. They also put a little note in, about what they think the reader needs to be aware of, particularly around terminology. You can also see here that they include their names, their student numbers and page numbers as a footer, and you can use a footer or a header, depends on yourself. They obviously have their header here, which is the title, The Features of ASD in the Workplace. Next page down, they move on to a table of contents, sort of their abstract, abbreviations, their little note. Then they have the specifics of their actual structure of their assignment. So they have an introduction, which takes 2 pages to complete. They then have a section on a literature review, and then they provide an introduction, background to autism, a history of ASD, definition of ASD, causes of autism, characteristics of autism, diagnosis of autism, and its prevalence. And the next section then to look at, and these are all subsectionalized, you can see that 2.2.1, 2.2.2, etc. Then they look at ASD in the workplace, and again they subsectionalize that into legislation around ASD, existing evidence around employment in ASD, and then they obviously look at the benefits, the sort of evidence base to employing people with ASD. They then move into their methodology section. Again, they introduce this, and then they provide an overview of forecasting methodology. They themselves were interested in trend extrapolation. They talk about scenarios. They talk about the Delphi method. They talk about a methodology that we haven't got onto yet, but that I will talk about in the next week or so, which is called backcasting. Now that's I suppose a mechanism of writing retrospectively, if you will, your scenarios, and we've already touched on that, but it's actually called backcasting. Then they provide under section 3.2.5 a rationale for combining forecasting methods. So you can see they've used a lot of different methods in this, which is very enriching to their overall product to produce. Then under section 4.4 they decide to talk about the drivers of change. So the drivers of change that obviously they've identified through their lit review are advocacy groups, medicine, technology, legislation, and the economy, and then they wang in, which I think is always very useful, a wild card. Now again, we discussed wild cards. These are sort of unknown variables, or unknowns probably too definitive of it's a speculation that certain phenomena or drivers of change or events may happen that will domino, by that I mean will impact upon the area of exploration that you have chosen to write your assignment on. And there's a pretty good resource, as you know, on the Moodle website, developed by the authors of the European Commission sponsored I Know reports on the futures, and they have a very interesting section on over 100 wildcards, would you believe? So you should be reading those and seeing what impact, if any, they may have on your particular research area. The authors here then, Aoife, Tara and Aoife, move on to presenting their findings under section 5.0. So they provide an introduction to their findings section, they provide an overview of the findings, and then they present their findings as I suspected and suggested that you might through the scenario method. So it's the most optimistic, the most pessimistic, and the most likely case scenario. Now they mix the scenario titles in a way that I wouldn't. It didn't do them particularly much harm, but I think you got. I think the consistency of title, and in some cases we saw from the Scottish Social Services discussion we had about the 4 worlds of care to 2025. Sometimes people give very non-specifically titled scenario names. Okay. Anyway, having gone through their scenarios, they then provide a conclusion and a set of recommendations on their research. They provide a bibliography, and then they provide appendices. And you can see the extent of the sorts of issues that they incorporate into their appendices. So Appendix 1, percentage change in world's population. Appendix 2, historical progression of autism, development and recognition in Ireland, diagnosis of autism, etc., etc., etc. So look, just to quickly scan through that then, you'll see precisely how they went about producing their work. So section 1.0, an introduction. They talk a little bit about the issue of ASD. Then they talk a little bit about futures. Then they move, and all along they're telling us what each of the sections of their project will explore. So they begin to look at the lit review, which is very important, as you all know, as I've just turned up my phone. They provide an introduction to this, and they give a good historical context. A good issue is to define what you're talking about. In their case, they want to look at the causes or the evidence that suggests what the causes are, the characteristics of autism, diagnosis of autism, its prevalence, ASD in the workplace. So you can see it's quite comprehensive. And what I'm kind of really looking for is to get into an exploration of their actual futures work. Now, obviously, I'll be posting this assignment to a specially labeled folder for you all to have a look at as a PDF in much more detail yourselves. So you can pick that. So it'll look at the methodology, which comes under section 3. They mention our old friend Richard Slaughter. They talk about the oracle. Now, I personally would have gone into perhaps more detail about what future studies is in that section. They talk about the overall forecasting methodology, which is good. And that is a good discussion there, but I think I would have had more, maybe up to a page on futures and forecasting as a subject or as a discipline in its own right. They then go into trend extrapolation. They talk about scenarios, talk about the Delphi method, which we've mentioned before, and how they went about using that. They also talk about backcasting, which, as I said, I will talk to you a little bit about as well, before we come to, as you know, I'm giving you a session on writing up scenarios. Okay, I suppose the big thing for me that it was probably missing, even though this got a very high grade, was a discussion on the time present. And this is something that I'll be looking out for. Why did it choose 2030? So they do a little bit here about the time present. You can see that. And they've probably reduced it to an appendix, but I prefer to see, if something's worth saying, it needs to be included in the main body of the text rather than in an actual appendix. Okay. Then they identify the drivers of change. They think that advocacy groups across Europe are very significant to this and will be significant. They identified medicine from the lit review is obviously going to be very important, technology, and so on and so forth, legislation. So I think that was a very, very interesting piece of work there. I'm now going to move on to look at another assignment, this time from 3 of our social care practice students from 2015. And again, their work generated a first-class honours classification. Okay, as I was alluding to, we're now going to have a look at an assignment written by Lucretia Murphy, Lorraine Siren, and Sandra Finan. Now, as you can see, the title of their assignment was Transcending the Gender Binary, the Futures of Sexuality and Gender Identity in Ireland to 2035. So again, they start out, again, structurally, it looks quite appealing to the eye, doesn't it? Where they provide an abstract, where they talk about what their actual paper will entail. Again, they provide student names and their ID numbers. Look at the word count, 7,989. So you're talking for 3 people, between 7.5 and 8,000 words. Yeah, that gives some of you wider context to what you need to be producing. Anyway, they again produce a content section. So look at this, the future of sexuality and gender in Irish society, introduction, the LGBTQI community in Ireland, difficult times, why examine the futures of sexuality and gender identity. Section 1, lit review. So they break their lit review, as you can see, wow, into a number of areas. So biological essentialism, social constructionism, psychoanalysis, cognitive development theories, feminism, disentangling sex and gender, the hidden sexes, making decisions too early, looking to the future, etogenesis, terminology, and conclusion. Now, that's a pretty serious deconstruction of the literature, which demonstrates to me a real grasp of what was what as they discovered it through the lit review. The second section they produced then is one on methodology. They talk about future studies, what is it, legitimizing the futures of approach, and then they don't give that an enormous amount of space, and then they move straight into the methodology in terms of having a vision, what gives us the right to have this vision, the value-based approach, and then they talk about the 40-year present. Following that, they move into the drivers of change, and they identified, again, I suppose, out of the lit review, that feminism, globalization, genetics, media, and legislative beginnings. So how do we make law? Who's making the law? That these will be the profound drivers on this particular topic. They then look at the vision and findings. So they obviously always provide continuity, linkage. We'll have a little look at that in a moment between various sections. So talk about the vision, the probability of their vision, the ethical issues that may arise in this future, and where does social care fit into this vision. So isn't it very interesting that instead of producing scenarios, they talk about a vision? And I like this approach as well, and I'll show you this. And again, this particular assignment will be on that specially labeled folder for you to look at before you come to compose your own work. So they talk about the probability of their vision, the ethical issues that may arise about this vision in the future, where does social care fit into the vision, and then the conclusion and bibliography. So just go through this in a little bit more depth. So they talk about the futures of sexuality and gender in Irish society, again provide us with a quote, and then they give us an introduction to their assignment. They talk about the LGBTQI community in Ireland, and they give some statistics and data. Why examine the future of sexuality and gender identity? So they give us a rationalization for why they've actually taken on this topic in the first place. Then they provide their lit review, and I keep emphasizing this to you, that this is one of the most important, I suppose, components of your assignment in many ways. Anyway, I'm going to zip through. I'm sure you'll find that assignment very interesting anyway, but I want to zip through to the actual methodological and drivers of change discussion that the authors had in generating this particular assignment. So if you just bear with me while I zip this down. Right, so section 2, methodology, what is it? So they provide a discussion on what is future studies. They also talk about, I suppose, justifying why we would take a futures and forecasting perspective. Yeah, which I think is quite good. And I mean, here we have the name checking, Wendell Bell, Richard Slaughter. Yeah. Then they talk about the methodology. So they initially they chose the Delphi method. It seemed more advantageous, blah blah blah. However, as you can see, due to the limitations and the unresponsiveness, that's an issue that we've come back to a number of occasions, of experts, they decided to change tact. And so after further, we decided to use the visioning method. And this visioning methodology is a common and popular approach for creating claims about the future. So to look at the work of van der Helm in 2009. Yeah, so I think that's quite good. So you guys might be interested in looking at van der Helm's work. And there are 7 different types of visioning depending on the type of future being conceptualized. So you can see what they are: the humanistic visioning, the religious or eschatological visioning. Yeah. The third is political visioning. The fourth is business visioning. The fifth is community visioning. The sixth is personal visioning. And the final form of visioning is a combination of the political, community, and humanistic visioning. So very interesting for you lot if you're interested in looking at that. You'll see the reference to that particular work of van der Helm in the bibliography. So they also try and justify why they have a right to use a vision. And then they have a discussion about the year present, which I like. Again, not a very detailed one. Again, that was probably an area they could have probably developed and deepened themselves. And then they went into the drivers of change. Now, again, these will all have become apparent to them from their wider literature review exposure. And I wanted to zip down here a bit further again, just to see how they presented their findings. So section 3, the vision and findings, again I have an introduction. I suspect that you could probably increase and develop the introductory section. So the vision, what led the way. So they tell us how they arrived at 2035. Okay, so it's quite an interesting way of doing this, I believe. Okay, and then how they present their conclusions then, as you can see, very interestingly, here we go, very short conclusion. I probably thought I would have, actually, here's the real conclusion. So they talk quite well about, how they went about producing the work, what the shortcomings, limitation of their works was, and bang, there we go. So let's just see if we can find van der Helm. I'm sure we will, but you can see the extent of this bibliography. It's quite comprehensive, I hear you think, and rightly so, given that it's the work of 3 people. So let's just see if we can find van der Helm. Sorry here now for distracting you all. There's a book I mentioned before to you, Hard Rheingold's The Virtual Community, kind of a major paradigm breaker back in the 80s. Come on, where are we? I didn't see van der Helm. Anyway, we shall find that. Maybe it was there, DER perhaps. We shall find that for you, and because it's quite an interesting piece of work, visioning. I think you'd like it. So, my dear friends, that is how you go about producing and putting together your Futures of Welfare write-up. And to reiterate, I will be placing a copy of both assignments in the specially labeled folder that I will email you about presently.